Good morning. Today, I had originally titled my sermon when I looked at the passages, Keep Watch. But as I really struggled with this passage over the last 2 weeks, I think I wrote 5 different sermons, and the title has landed in a completely different place. The title this morning is, What is Wisdom Anyway? The parable of the wise and foolish virgins, as it is called, is sometimes also called the parable of the wise and foolish bridesmaids. It's one of those stories that I confess when I get to in the Bible that I sometimes skip, because I get to it and I think, oh yes, that one. I know this story. The moral is be prepared, come the right time to the wedding. This is one of the easy ones. Then I thought about it this week. Really? Jesus just is telling people to be prepared? He sounds a bit more like a Boy Scout leader than he does Jesus. Because the parables of Jesus are stories that often turn around our sense of reality. Their intention is to come into our lives and upset what we think we know. Parables literally mean that. It means to overthrow or overturn. The word parable in Greek, to twist, upend, and make us think differently. So when I come to a parable and I think I know what it means, I reread it. And this parable in the last 2 weeks has offered me a rereading that has changed my understanding of this story nearly completely. So this morning, I ask that you would lay aside what you think is the moral of this story and reread these verses in your mind with me, and listen as a much stranger and even confusing tale presents itself. If you listen carefully to the story that Jesus is telling, remember, this is a story, it's a fiction story. This did not happen. Jesus is using a story to make a point. In the story that Jesus is telling, the groom is delayed. That's just strange in and of itself. There are several commentators who say that this parable might be called the parable of the woefully late bridegroom. I've seen all those movies. I know what happens when a groom is late. You have a bride standing somewhere off in the wings with her bridesmaids, and the groom or the bride is freaking out. Where is he? Where is he? Am I being jilted? What's going on here? And that's what's happening here. It's the groom is late. Anything that happens in this parable from this point on is the groom's fault. And the groom is so late that the bridesmaids all fall asleep. Now, it makes me laugh too, because what kind of bridesmaids are these, you know? And not only is there no groom, but if you read the passage, guess what? There's no bride. There is only a groom and bridesmaids in this story. Where's the bride? Did she get tired of waiting for him? Did she leave? We have no idea where the bride is, but finally this groom shows up, and the young women are roused, from their slumber. It's interesting that all 10 of the virgins of the bridesmaids, they fall asleep, and when they wake up, they discover that only half of them have enough oil for their lamps, and so the oilless bridesmaids ask the other bridesmaids to share. And this is where the other really weird piece of this comes in. The ones who have the oil say, no, you go get it yourselves. Now, I don't know about you all, but one of the first lessons I ever learned in Sunday school is that Jesus taught us to like one another and be kind and to share. This is really strange. And so the well-supplied bridesmaids refuse to share. These chicks are kind of mean. And they direct their friends. They said, you go buy it for yourselves. So what I want to know is not only why they were so mean, but where exactly do you buy oil in the middle of the night in ancient Israel? Is there like a 24-hour Walmart lamp oil department somewhere? None of this is making any sense. The ones without oil, well, they know they're not going to get anywhere, and so they go off, and after they purchase their supplies, they come back to the party. The bridegroom is now there, only to have the bridegroom slam the door in their faces and send them away like they are uninvited wedding party crashers who are trying to get in. Now, I'm really glad you left, because who does this? Who would act like this in real life? And if you stop and think about it, the allegory we usually tell is that Jesus is the bridegroom. But if he is, he's really not a very good groom. He's kind of a careless guy and a little mean to boot. Where's the Jesus who turns 5 loaves of bread into a meal for 5,000? A little bit of oil shouldn't have been a problem for him. Or the Jesus who knew that hospitality, the welcome of strangers, was the most important practice of faith. Where's the Jesus who opens doors and lets in drunkards and gluttons and sinners and tax collectors? Where is that Jesus? He's mad because a group of bridesmaids didn't come without flasks of oil? And honestly, I can't get the question out of my mind, where is that bride? To me, your response to me was just right. Because this parable, if we let ourselves go there, it's more like a comedy than it is like something that's serious. It's a little bit more like the movie 27 Dresses or Bridesmaids, if you ever saw that great old film about the completely inept bridesmaids. It's more like those things than a serious theological lesson. And that's when it hit me. Maybe this is exactly what this parable is. Maybe it was always intended to be funny. Maybe this is an extended Jesus joke. And perhaps we're not supposed to read it with a straight face. It's hard to imagine that the people who first heard it, just like you did, weren't laughing. They probably thought this was hilarious. They, too, probably thought it sounded like the worst wedding ever. Excuse me. Who wants to go to a party where the groom is nasty to the guests and shows up so late? Where is that bride? There should be no fear of missing out here, no FOMO, as the kids say, because this is the one party you're glad you were never invited to. I think that we've missed the point. That long interpretation of be prepared with Jesus, the Boy Scout troop leader, does not take into account the 2 most important words in this story. And those are the words wise and foolish. Wise and foolish. Those 2 words call to mind a biblical tradition that is not of the parables. Instead, as soon as you hear wise and foolish, our minds should go back, especially if we were good Jews listening to Jesus, our minds should go back to the book of Proverbs and wisdom literature. Parables are these little fiction stories meant to upend our sense of reality. Parables are full of metaphors and analogies, and they are often allegories. Oh, Jesus is the bridegroom. The bridesmaids are XYZ. The oil stands for this. The lamps are standing in for something else. Those are all allegorical interpretations. And that's what parables do. Parables use allegories to make their hearers stop and think about our assumptions of faith in God. But Proverbs and other wisdom writings aren't that. Proverbs and wisdom writings are witticisms, often funny, little, memorable contrasts, full of imaginative poetry and provocative quips. The purpose of wisdom literature is to teach readers how to live here and now in this world with justice and mercy and in community with one another. In this story, the word wise in Greek is the word phronimos. Phronimos. And that means practical wisdom, shrewdness, savvy, being sensible or prudent. Matthew uses phronenos 7 times in his gospel. But I bet in a congregation like this, you're very familiar with the other word in the New Testament that shows up for wisdom, and that is Sophia. Sophia means not practical wisdom, savvy, shrewdness, all those things, but Sophia means divine wisdom, knowledge of sacred matters, the insight into mystery. Matthew does use the word Sophia, so I know he knew it. Matthew uses Sophia once in his book, where Jesus uses it to speak of himself. And this is the quote from Matthew 11. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom, he's pointing at himself, we believe, at that moment. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. The wise, quote-unquote, bridesmaids are phronenos. They are full of practical wisdom. They brought flasks of oil to refill their lamps. They are never called Sophia. There's no mention of them being attuned to divine insight or divine or sacred mystery. And they contended with the foolish bridesmaids, that's the contrast, making this sound more like a proverb than a typical parable. And foolish in Greek is the word moros, a word that can be translated into English as flat, dull, insipid, or nonsensical. And so you see what the witticism in the story is. It's the contrast between those who are full of practical wisdom, shrewdness, and savvy, and those who are dullards. Maybe they're the kind of people who have their head in the clouds. We call them dreamers. They possess little or no common sense. Now, in our world, and probably in the world that Jesus inhabited too, the people we praise are those who are shrewd. We praise those who are full of common sense. And we sometimes look at those who have their heads in the clouds and we go, oh, what good are they ever going to be in the world? We teach our children to be prudent and practical, sensible, be prepared, we tell them. But maybe this is a comedy because Jesus had a different idea. Certainly, the Apostle Paul did. 3 decades before the Gospel of Matthew was written, the Apostle Paul penned these words to his friends in Corinth. Do not deceive yourselves. If you think you are wise in this age, you should become fools so that you might become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. For it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, and they are futile. Now, Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, does not use the word phronimos. He used the word Sophia. But he refers to Sophia, he uses it in a very unusual way. He calls it the Sophia of this world. In effect, he's saying it's the kind of wisdom that this world values. And I think that what he means is it's the kind that the world praises, kind of a practical wisdom, that idea of being sensible or shrewd or savvy. Earlier in his letter to the Corinthians, Paul explicitly calls Jesus the Sophia of God, in the same way Jesus called himself that in the Gospel of Matthew. And Paul explicitly set up a contrast between worldly wisdom, which was passing away, which was deceptive, which was foolish, and divine wisdom, which is an insight into God and the purposes that God has had since the beginning of time. So in this letter and all his other letters, Paul makes this contrast over and over and over again. There are two kinds of wisdom, Paul insists. One that is conventional, one that is common sense, one that the world knows, and that one is really foolishness. It's inverted. And the other, divine wisdom, is the source of life and salvation. I'm really wondering if that's the very point Jesus is making in this story. Maybe all of those people who are called wise, we're supposed to laugh at them because they're really being foolish. Maybe it's not a parable, as I suggested above, an allegory with a theological point about the end times. But maybe it is a kind of extended, very funny proverb about wisdom and what wisdom really is. Because if we look at the end of the parable, story, whatever we want to call it that Jesus is telling, what do these practical bridesmaids actually get? They get to go to a party when they are exhausted in the middle of the night where there does not seem to be a bride, and the groom at best is a bore. They are locked in with him at this miserable affair for who knows how long, and half of their friends aren't even there to celebrate with them. Honestly, if we think about it, the ones who are outside the door might get the better side of this bargain. Because if we run this parable next to Jesus' other stories about weddings, we hear some really interesting things. What about people who come to parties? Well, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Don't invite your rich friends and all the people you know, but when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, Jesus says. And just a few pages before this story today in Matthew, Jesus told the parable about a king who instructs his servants, go out into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet. Maybe the wise bridesmaids, the ones who are full of worldly shrewdness, common sense and practical wisdom, maybe they went to the wrong party with a bad bridegroom. Maybe the real party hasn't started yet. Sometimes phronimos, practical wisdom, isn't all it's cracked up to be. And what about those foolish bridesmaids, the ones who are locked out, the young women who are standing in the streets, feeling like they've been left behind? Were they about to receive an invitation to the king's wedding? Was someone about to come by and say, hey, those doors might be closed to you, but there is such a better party waiting? Being kicked out of one party is simply an invitation to wait for the real one. Because the king's party is going to be the party to end all parties. And perhaps, just perhaps, they weren't going to be bridesmaids at that party. Perhaps at that party, they are finally going to be the bride. Because who else is the bride? Except for the poor, the crippled, the lame, the tossed out, those of us who have had doors closed in our face, the unwanted, the unwashed, those whom Jesus greets on every street and welcomes to his table. For the wisdom of this world, says the Apostle Paul, is foolishness with God. The words at the end of Jesus' wisdom story proverb, which sometimes are keep watch, that's one interpretation. I think the better interpretation, the more literal one, is stay awake. So the words stay awake at the end of Jesus' wisdom story proverb now sound like less of a threat. How often have we heard this proverb? And the reason I skip over it is that I hate that ending. Keep watch, stay awake, because if you miss it, I'm slamming the door in your face and you're going to hell. This is what this proverb is usually used for. It's usually used as a proverb to exclude and to threaten and to scare people into hell. But what if it's not a threat? What if it's actually funny? And what if it's a send up on the world's wisdom that really becomes an invitation, not to be prepared or I'm going to punish you, but be discerning. Pay attention to what's really going on here. Stay awake so you end up at the right party. Understanding the difference between the wisdom of this world and the divine wisdom of God. What a great invitation to all of us. Keep awake, therefore, for we know neither the day nor the hour. Your invitation awaits, and the best banquet is being prepared. Amen.